Welcome to a special Coffee with Dragon edition, reading, studying, educational edition. It is August 22nd, Tuesday, and we'll be doing a special reading educational cup of coffee, 23rd, April 23rd, after which we'll be doing some exercising for mind, body, and spirit, healing, strengthening, and transformation. Grab yourself a cup of coffee and join me, yours truly, Adrian h.a.dragan, Universal Spiritual Teacher, World LGBTQ citizen, and multidisciplinary international artist. Special Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations selections, that is, of reading, have in Montreal, Hawk Island, in NDG, there's these boxes where people exchange books, and so do trade books, put books, take books, put books, take books, and I've been doing so for a few years. Have to say that paradoxically, or providentially, paradoxically, and prophetically, if you will, at the present moment in time that I'm reading this, am not wealthy. I'm actually struggling financially. I'm unemployed, looking for opportunities for my art, such as Mother Nature dances, challenging, of course, Donald Trump to a boxing match on the Canadian-US border with my project Build a Ring to build a Coliseum. Need financing with that, and help and support and love, and more love and plus love. I'm in debt about 11,000 or so, paying interest about 80 a month, which kind of sucks a lot. Made a few bucks here and there, my poetry, but nonetheless, this is the situation. So Adam Smith, who was Adam Smith? Well, in 1776, providentially some would say occurring with the Declaration of Independence of United States of America from the British Empire. We'll not go into that history, we'll not digress. As you know, Draganisms, if you watched any of my cup of coffees with Dragon, they are Draganisms and digressions and other such digressions, which is called a Draganism. Get yourself ready, a cup of coffee. We will be going for 37 minutes, or maybe 42, or maybe 66. Who knows, maybe even reaching 77, but I'm going to work out afterwards a bit. So this is the training of the mind and the body, and tonight at midnight, the spirit. This cup of coffee with Dragon is dedicated to world peace, international LGBTQ rights, and addressing financial economic inequality. With, of course, pitching my Mother Nature dances, my current ongoing project of organizing worldwide dances for the environment here from Montreal, also known as Hawk Island, and locally, and then in all the cities internationally, to fund more solar power and more means and education, and for people, individuals, and as units of society to do it also collectively, jointly, in a cooperative, collaborative, together we win philosophy. Coffee with Dragon. I am not the dragon. You are not the dragon. We are the dragon. As the philosophy, we are the dragon. Nobody is the dragon. None is by itself the dragon, but we are the dragon. So you are not the dragon, I am not the dragon. We are becoming the dragon. Coffee. Coffee time. The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith. Introduction and Plan of the Work. Book 1 of the Causes of Improvement in the Productive Powers of Labor, and of the order according to which its produce is naturally distributed among the different ranks of the people. Chapter 1 of the Division of Labor. Chapter 2 of the Principle which gives occasion to the division of labor. Chapter 3 that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. Chapter 4 of the origin and use of money. Chapter 5 of the real and nominal price of commodities, or of their price in labor and their price in money. So I'm not going to follow the order, but we'll go to chapter 4 first, of the origin and use of money. And keep in mind, this is Adam Smith from The Wealth of Nations. Chapter 6, of the component parts of the price of commodities. Chapter 7, of the natural and market price of commodities. Chapter 8, of the wages of labor. Chapter 9, of the profits of stock. Of Chapter 11, of the rent of land. Conclusion of the chapter. Book 2, of the nature, accumulation, and employment of stock. Chapter 3, of the accumulation of capital or of productive and unproductive labor. Book 4, of systems of political economy. Chapter 2, of restraints upon the importation from foreign countries of such goods as can be produced at home. Chapter 9, of the agricultural systems or of those systems of political economy which represent the produce of land as either the sole or the principal source of the revenue and wealth of every country. Book 5, of the revenue of the sovereign or commonwealth. Chapter 2, of the sources of the general or public revenue of the society. Part 2, of taxes. So we'll be reading the introduction and we'll be jumping to the origin and use of money, because of course I'm an advocate of debt transmission, or transfusion rather. It's a theory that I've written in the past years of local national economic reform for recovery, strengthening, and security, and it has to do with the creation of a world currency, of a global international currency, or one unit of exchange. And so we'll be jumping up to that. We'll not go into my own theories. I'm a theorist, of course, philosophical, economic, social theorist, and of course a independent psychological theorist, and social theorist, and economic theorist. So we'll be reading the introduction. An inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Adam Smith. The annual labor of every nation is the fund which originally supplies it with all the necessaries and conveniences of life, which it annually consumes, and which consist always either in the immediate produce of that labor, or in what is purchased with that produce from other nations. So here referring to international trade, of course. According, therefore, as this produce or what is produced with it bears a greater or smaller proportion to the number of those who are to consume it, the nation will be better or worse supplied with all the necessaries and conveniences for which it has occasion. But this proportion must in every nation be regulated by two different circumstances. First, by the skill, dexterity, and judgment with which its labor is generally applied, and secondly, by the proportion between the number of those who are employed in useful labor and that of those who are not so employed. Whatever be the soil, climate, or extent of territory of any particular nation, the abundance of or scantiness of its annual supply must, in that particular situation, depend upon those two circumstances. The abundance or scantiness of this supply, too, seems to depend more upon the former of those two circumstances than upon the latter. Among the savage nations of hunters and fishers, keep in mind that this is written in 1776, every individual who is able to work is more or less employed in useful labor and endeavors to provide as well as he can the necessaries and conveniences of life for himself or such of his family or tribe as are either too cold or too young or too infirm to go a hunting and fishing. Such nations, however, are so miserably poor that from mere want they are frequently reduced, or at least think themselves reduced, to the necessity sometimes of directly destroying and sometimes of abandoning their infants, their old people, and those afflicted with lingering diseases to perish with hunger or to be devoured by wild beasts. Among civilized and thriving nations, on the contrary, though a great number of people do not labor at all, many of whom consume the produce of 10 times, frequently of 100 times more labor than the greater part of those who work, yet the produce of the whole labor of the society is so great that all are often abundantly supplied, and a workman even of the lowest and poorest order is, if he is frugal and industrious, may enjoy a greater share of the necessaries and conveniences of life than it is possible for any savage to acquire. Whatever be the actual state of the skill, dexterity, and judgment with which labor is applied in any nation, the abundance or scantiness of its annual supply must depend, during the continuance of that state, upon the proportion between the number of those who are annually employed in useful labor and that of those who are not so employed. The number of useful and productive laborers, it will hereafter appear, is everywhere in proportion to the quantity of capital stock which is employed in setting them to work, and to the particular way in which it is so employed. The second book, therefore, treats of the nature of capital stock, of the manner in which it is gradually accumulated, and of the different quantities of labor which it puts into motion according to the different ways in which it is employed. Nations tolerably well advanced as to skill, dexterity, and judgment in the application of labor have followed very different plans in the general conduct or direction of it, and those plans have not all been equally favorable to the greatness of its produce. The policy of some nations has given extraordinary encouragement to the industry of the country, and that of others to the industry of towns. Scarce any nation has dealt equally and impartially with every sort of industry since the downfall of the Roman Empire. Since the downfall of the Roman Empire, the policy of Europe has been more favorable to arts, manufactures, and commerce, the industry of towns, than to agriculture, the industry of the country. Though those different plans were perhaps first introduced by the private interests and prejudices of particular orders of men, without any regard to or foresight of their consequences upon the general welfare of the society, yet they have given occasion to very different theories of political economy, of which some magnify the importance of that industry which is carried on in towns, others of that which is carried on in the country. Those theories have had a considerable influence not only upon the opinions of men of learning, but upon the public conduct of princes and sovereign states. Keep in mind that I'm not going to be, at least not fully, or just perhaps in some places, going to add my own philosophy or interpretation of the writings, or criticisms, or not, or approval, or discussion, or surrounding what's written, but mostly will be, this cup of coffee with Dragon will be of just reading the text per se, and will limit the analysis, the criticisms, and the commentary of yours truly, Adrian h.a.dragan thereof. So we'll be going to will not follow the pattern prescribed, but we'll be going on directly to actually what we'll do instead, since we started at page 1, we'll be going up to page 37 and finish on the origin and use of money at page 37. Okay, page 37 we'll finish it. Alright, ready, stretch. Now, book 1. Sip of coffee, since it's such a lofty book, I'm gonna sweeten it a bit since it's the wealth of nations, and this honey, so we'll do a little bit of meditation. Pure liquid honey that do have here. One, let your servant be healed. Let your servant's enemies be stricken. Pestilence. Let your servants fall. Just an analysis. So this honey, question is, was it imported? From where? And since what we read, if Adam Smith Adam Smith, can you come? He's in sixth heaven or perhaps hell. I don't know where he is, but let's conjure Adam Smith's soul. Adam Smith, come to us, Adam Smith. Adam Smith. He's busy learning about what twerking is. Anyways, coffee with dragon. So craft. It's kosher. That's very good for my half Jewish side. Pure liquid honey. It's not a lot, but you know, you mass produce it. So there's two types, or three types of labor. There's production, distribution, and sale, right? You have to analyze in a modern context. So the producers, then the distributors, the one that use the transportation, if it's not vertically or perhaps horizontally integrated corporation, we have to look into it. Craft, if is it horizontally, vertically integrated, what's happening and what's the deal. And of course, to the production, which happens at the B level, and then the distribution, which let's say could include just the transportation or actually the packaging, right, of the honey. Was it procured, bought from X, and processed? How was it done, right? It's all good economic, financial, commercial questions about this honey that I just put in the coffee, just like the coffee. Production, distribution, sale, value. Anyways, draganisms aside, Book 1 of the causes of improvement in the productive powers of labor and of the order according to which its produce is naturally distributed among the different ranks of the people. Chapter 1 of the division of labor. The greatest improvement in the productive powers of labor and the greater part of the skill, dexterity, and judgment with which it is anywhere directed or applied seem to have been the effects of the division of labor. The effects of the division of labor in the general business of society will be more easily understood by considering in what manner it operates in some particular manufactures. It is commonly supposed to be carried furthest in some very trifling ones, not perhaps that it really is carried further in them than in others or of more importance, but in those trifling manufactures which are destined to supply the small wants of but a small number of people. And the whole number of workmen must necessarily be small, and those employed in every different branch of the work can often be collected into the same workhouse and placed at once under the view of the spectator. Interesting how he, of the spectator, kind of only him kind of knows what he meant there, but yeah. In those great manufacturers, on the contrary, which are destined to supply the great wants of the great body of the people, every different branch of the work employs so great a number of workmen that it is impossible to collect them all into the same workhouse. We can seldom see more at one time than those employed in one single branch, though in such manufactures, therefore, the work may really be divided into a much greater number of parts than in those of a more trifling nature. The division is not near so obvious and has accordingly been much less observed. To take an example, therefore, from a very trifling manufacture, but one in which the division of labor has been very often taken notice of, the trade of the pin maker, a workman not educated to this business, which the division of labor has rendered a distinct trade, nor acquainted with the use of the machinery employed in it, to the invention of which the same division of labor has probably given occasion, could scarce perhaps with his utmost industry make one pin in a day, and certainly could not make 20. But in the way in which this business is now carried on, not only the whole work is a peculiar trade, but it is divided into a number of branches, of which the greater part are likewise peculiar trades. So just to make a draganism here, that is an interjection and digression and relative or comic or whatever you want to call it. A draganism is something can be comic, funny, witty. It's a draganism. I'm going to take such big corporations as Amazon here to the last three phrases that we read in the division of labor, and of course how diverse it is. And it continues, but in the way in which this business is now carried on, not only the whole work is a peculiar trade, but it is divided into a number of branches, of which the greater part are likewise peculiar trades. One man draws out the wire, another straightens it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, A fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. To make the head requires 2 or 3 distinct operations. To put it on is a peculiar business. To whiten the pins is another. It is even a trade by itself to put them into the paper, and the important business of making a pin is, in this manner, divided into about 18 distinct operations, which in some manufactories are all performed by distinct hands, though in others the same man will often perform 2 or 3 of them. I have seen a small manufactory of this kind where 10 men only were employed, and where some of them consequently performed 2 or 3 distinct operations. But though they were very poor, and therefore but indifferently accommodated with the necessary machinery, they could, when they exerted themselves, make among them about 12 pounds of pins in a day. There are in a pound upwards of 4,000 pins of a middling size. Those 10 persons therefore could make among them upwards of 48,000 pins in a day. Each person therefore making a tenth part of 48,000 pins might be considered as making 4,800 pins in a day. But if they had all wrought separately and independently, and without any of them having been educated to this peculiar business, they certainly could not each of them have made 20, perhaps not 1 pin in a day. That is certainly not the 240th, perhaps not the 400, not the 4,800 part of what they are at the present capable of performing, in consequence of a proper division and combination of their different operations. In every other art and manufacture, the effects of the division of labor are similar to what they are in this very trifling one, though in many of them the labor can neither be so much subdivided nor reduced to so great a simplicity of operation. The division of labor, however, so far as it can be introduced, occasions in every art a not proportional it says, but proportionable, proportionable increase of the productive powers of labor. The separation of different trades and employments from one another seems to have taken place in consequence of this advantage. This separation too is generally carried furthest in those countries which enjoy the highest degree of industry and improvement. What is the work of one man is a rude state of society, being generally that of several in an improved one. In every improved society, the farmer is generally nothing but a farmer, the manufacturer nothing but a manufacturer. The labor too, which is necessary to produce any one complete manufacture, is almost always divided among a great number of hands. How many different trades are employed in each branch of the linen and wool manufactures, from the growers of the flax and the wool to the bleachers and smoothers of the linen, or to the dyers and dressers of the cloth. The nature of agriculture, indeed, does not admit of so many subdivisions of labor, nor of so complete a separation of one business from another as manufactures. It is impossible to separate so entirely the business of the grazier from that of the corn farmer, as the trade of the carpenter is commonly separated from that of the smith. The spinner is almost always a distinct person from the weaver, but the plowman, the harrower, the sower of the seed, and the reaper of the corn are often the same. The occasions for those different sorts of labor returning with the different seasons of the year, it is impossible that one man should be constantly employed in any one of them. This impossibility of making so complete an entire separation. Keep in mind that this is the English of 1776, and we might not be that familiar with this English of more than almost 250 years ago. So how it's written, it's the English of 1776 when this was published. Bear this in mind. This impossibility of making so complete and entire a separation of all the different branches of labor employed in agriculture is perhaps the reason why the improvement of the productive powers of labor in this art does not always keep pace with their improvement in manufactures. The most opulent nations, indeed, generally excel at their neighbors in agriculture as well as in manufactures, but they are commonly more distinguished by their superiority in the latter than in the former. Their lands are in general better cultivated, and having more labor and expense bestowed upon them, produce more in proportion to the extent and natural fertility of the ground. But this superiority of produce is seldom much more than in proportion to the superiority of labor and expense. In agriculture, the labor of the rich country is not always much more productive than that of the poor, or at least it is never so much more productive as is commonly is in manufacture. The corn of the rich country, therefore, will not always, in the same degree of goodness, come cheaper to market than that of the poor. The corn of Poland, in the same degree of goodness, is as cheap as that of France, notwithstanding the superior opulence and improvement of the latter country. The corn of France is the corn provinces fully as good as in most years nearly the same price with the corn of England, though in opulence and improvement France is perhaps inferior to England. The corn lands of England, however, are better cultivated than those of France, and the corn lands of France are said to be much better cultivated than those of Poland. But though the poor country, notwithstanding the inferiority of its cultivation, can in some measure rival the rich in the cheapness and goodness of its corn, it can pretend to no such competition in its manufactures, at least if those manufactures suit the soil, climate, and situation of the rich country. The silks of France are better and cheaper than those of England, because the silk manufacture, at least under the present high duties upon the importation of raw silk, does not so well suit the climate of England as that of France. But the hardware of the and the coarse woolens of England are beyond all comparison superior to those of France, and much cheaper too in the same degree of goodness. In Poland there are said to be scarce any manufactures of any kind, a few of those coarser household manufactures excepted, without which no country can well subsist. This great increase of the quantity of work which, in consequence of the division of labor, the same number of people are capable of performing, is owing to three different circumstances. First, to the increase of dexterity in every particular workman. Secondly, to the saving of the time which is commonly lost in passing from one species of work to another. And lastly, to the invention of a great number of machines which facilitate and abridge labor and enable one man to do the work of many. First, the improvement of the dexterity of the workman necessarily increases the quantity of the work that he can perform, and the division of labor by reducing every man's business to some one simple operation, and by making this operation the sole employment in his life, necessarily increases very much the dexterity of the workman. So keep in mind that Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is the pillar, the fundamental, and I'll say the core from which modern capitalism expanded and many other schools of thought emerged. But Adam Smith's really this book, The Wealth of Nations, is still the fundamental and the pillars of modern capitalism as we know it after the mercantilist age of protectionism, mercantilistic protectionism. A common smith who, though accustomed to handle the hammer, has never been used to make nails. If upon some particular occasion he is obliged to attempt it, will scarce, I am assured, to be able to make above 200 or 300 nails in a day, and those very bad ones, and those two very bad ones. A smith who has been accustomed to make nails, but whose sole or principal business has not been that of a nailer, can seldom, with his utmost diligence, make more than 800 or 1,000 nails in a day. I have seen several boys under 20 years of age who had never exercised any other trade but that of making nails, and who, when they exerted themselves, could make each of them upwards of 2,300 nails in a day. The making of a nail, however, is by no means one of the simplest operations. The same person blows the bellows, stirs or mends the fire as there is occasion, heats the iron, forges every part of the nail. In forging the head too, he is obliged to change his tools. The different operations into which the making of a pin or of a metal button is subdivided are all of them much more simple, and the dexterity of the person of whose life it has been the sole business to perform them is usually much greater. The rapidity with which some of the operations of those manufactures are performed exceeds what the human hand could, by those who had never seen them, be supposed capable of acquiring. Secondly, the advantage which is gained by saving the time commonly lost in passing from one sort of work to another is much greater than we should at first view be apt to imagine it. It is possible to pass very quickly from one kind of work to another that is carried on in a different place and with quite different tools. A country weaver who cultivates a small farm must lose a good deal of time in passing from his loom to the field and from the field to his loom. When the two trades can be carried on in the same workhouse, the loss of time is no doubt much less. It is even in this case, however, very considerable. A man commonly saunters, Saunters. A man commonly saunters, Saunters. Saunters a little in turning his head from one sort of employment to another. When he first begins the new work, he is seldom very keen and hearty. His mind, as they say, does not go to it, and for some time he rather trifles than applies to good purpose. The habit of sauntering and of indolent, careless application, which is naturally or rather necessarily acquired by every country workman who is obliged to change his work and his tools every half hour and to apply his hand in 20 different ways almost every day of his life, renders him almost always slothful and lazy, and incapable of any vigorous application even on the most pressing occasions. Independent, therefore, of his deficiency in point of dexterity, this cause alone must always reduce considerably the quantity of work which he is capable of performing. Thirdly and lastly, everybody must be sensible how much labor is facilitated and abridged by the application of proper machinery. It is unnecessary to give any example. I shall only observe, therefore, that the invention of all those machines by which labor is so much facilitated and abridged seems to have been originally owing to the division of labor. Men are much more likely to discover easier and readier methods of attaining any object when the whole attention of their minds is directed towards that single object than when it is dissipated among a great variety of things. But in consequence of the division of labor, the whole of every man's attention comes naturally to be directed towards some one very simple object. It is naturally to be expected, therefore, that some one or other of those who are employed in each particular branch of labor should soon find out easier and readier methods of performing their own particular work, whatever the nature of it admits of such improvement. A great part of the machines made use of in those manufactures in which labor is most subdivided were originally the inventions of common workmen, who, being each of them employed in some very simple operation, naturally turned their thoughts towards finding out easier and readier methods of performing it. Whoever has been much accustomed to visit such manufactures must frequently have been shown very pretty machines, which were the inventions of such workmen, in order to facilitate and quicken their own particular part of the work. In the first fire engines, a boy was constantly employed to open and shut alternately the communication between the boiler and the cylinder, according as the piston either ascended or descended. One of those boys who loved to play with his companions observed that by tying a string from the handle of the valve which opened this communication to another part of the machine, the valve would open and shut without his assistance, and leave him at liberty to divert himself with his playfellows. One of the greatest improvements that has been made upon this machine since it was first invented was in this manner the discovery of a boy who wanted to save his own labor. All the improvements in machinery, however, have by no means been the inventions of those who had occasion to use the machines. Many improvements have been made by the ingenuity of the makers of the machines when to make them became the business of a peculiar trade, and some of that of those who are called philosophers, or men of speculation, whose trade it is not to do anything, but to observe everything, and who upon that account are often capable of combining together the powers of the most distant and dissimilar objects. It's me in many ways. I'm going to read that again. Peculiar trade, and some by that of those who are called philosophers or men of speculation, whose trade it is not to do anything, but to observe everything, and who, upon that account, are often capable of combining together the powers of the most distant and dissimilar objects. Well, once again, peculiar trade, and some by that of those who are called philosophers or men of speculation, whose trade it is not to do anything, but to observe everything, and who, upon that account, are often capable of combining together the powers of the most distant and dissimilar objects. In the progress of society, philosophy or speculation becomes, like every other employment, the principal or sole trade and occupation of a particular class of citizens. Like every other employment, too, it is subdivided into a great number of different branches, each of which affords occupation to a peculiar tribe or class of philosophers, and this subdivision of employment in philosophy, as well as in every other business, improves dexterity and saves time. Each individual becomes more expert in his own peculiar branch. More work is done upon the whole, and the quantity of science is considerably increased by it. It is the great multiplication of the productions of all the different arts, in consequence of the division of labor, which occasions in a well-governed society that universal opulence which extends itself to the lowest ranks of the people. Page 13. Every workman has a great quantity of his own work to dispose of beyond what he himself has occasion for, and every other workman being exactly in the same situation is enabled to exchange a great quantity of his own goods for a great quantity, or what comes to the same thing, for the price of a great quantity of theirs. He supplies them abundantly with what they have occasion for, and they accommodate him as amply with what he has occasion for, and a general plenty diffuses itself through all the different ranks of the society. Observe the accommodation of the most common artificer or day laborer in a civilized and thriving country, and you will perceive that the number of people of whose industry a part, though but a small part, has been employed in procuring him this accommodation exceeds all computation. Well written. The woolen coat, for example, which covers the day laborer, as coarse and rough as it may appear, is the produce of the joint labor of a great multitude of workmen. The shepherd, the sorter of the wool comber, comber, or carder, the dyer, the scribbler, the spinner, the weaver, the fuller, the dresser, with many others, must all join their different arts in order to complete even this homely production. How many merchants and carriers besides must have been employed in transporting the materials from some of those workmen to others who often live in a very distant part of the country? How much commerce and navigation in particular? How many shipbuilders, sailors, sailmakers, rope makers must have been employed in order to bring together the different drugs made use of by the dyer? And it's actually written the different drugs for some reason. Made use of by the dyer, which often come from the remotest corners of the world. Requires, of course, a certain level of contemplation, imagination, and meditation upon the writings. Yeah. But just imagine it is as relevant today as it was written in 1776 in this regard. For example, let's say this: my black. This is made in it's made in China. It has 80% leather. The tissue, that is, the fabric, it's 80% leather, and the lining is 100% polyester. Label is affixed to compliance with provincial law. So it says 05/2017 it was produced. It even has the date of production: January, February, March, April, May. So it's going to be 2 years in this production next month, right? So if it's good for 3.5 years, let's say 42 months from the date of production, that would mean 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2.5 years. So May, June, July, August, September, October, November, right? We don't know the date. It says 05/2017, so it was produced in China on that day, right? But the leather came from a place, unless they everything was produced there in China there, but China's a huge country, right? And China, of course, is has become in the past since 1984 the biggest exporter and by extension, of course, producer of goods in the world. United States being the biggest consumer and importer of goods, so importer, and they're locked in a trade war which affects international economics. So that being stated, it's um, even the different parts, right? It has three, well, actually four parts: one, two, three, four. Even the metal used might have come from a different part. Even this plastic might have come from a different part of China, right? The leather, right? So this might have come from different parts, different producers brought there together. So different people involved to create this, right? The woolen coat, for example, which covers the day laborers, coarse and rough as it may appear, is the product of the joint labor of a great multitude of workmen. The shepherd, the sorter of the wool, the woolcomber, or carter, the dyer, the scribbler, the spinner, the weaver, the fuller, the dresser, with many others, must all join their different arts in order to complete even this homely production. How many merchants and carriers besides must have been employed in transporting the materials from some of those workmen to others who often live in a very distant part of the country? How much commerce and navigation in particular, how many shipbuilders, sailors, sailmakers, rope makers must have been employed in order to bring together the different drugs made use of by the dyer, which often come from the remotest corners of the world, right? Came from China. I mean, Montreal, Hawk Island, Canada, right? So transportation on the sea, so different levels of the international trade commerce were integrated to make it possible. All right. How much commerce and navigation in particular? How many shipbuilders, sailors, sailmakers, and from the remote corners of the world? What a variety of labor too is necessary in order to produce the tools of the meanest of those workmen. To say nothing of such complicated machines as the ship of the sailor, the mill of the fuller, or even the loom of the weaver. Let us consider only what a variety of labor is requisite in order to form that very simple machine, the shears with which the shepherd clips the wool, the miner, the builder of the furnace for smelting the ore, the feller of the timber, the burner of the charcoal to be made use of in the smelting house, the brickmaker, the bricklayer, the workmen who attend the furnace, the millwright, the forger, the smith, must all of them join their different arts in order to produce them. Were we to examine, in the same manner, all the different parts of his dress and household furniture, the coarse linen shirt which he wears next his skin, the shoes which cover his feet, the bed which he lies on, and all the different parts which compose it, the kitchen grate at which he prepares his victuals, 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 the coals which he makes use of for that purpose, dug from the bowels of the earth, and brought to him perhaps by a long sea and a long land carriage, all the other utensils of his kitchen, all the furniture of his table, the knives and forks, the earthen or pewter plates upon which he serves up and divides his victuals, the different hands employed in preparing his bread and his beer, the glass window which lets in the heat and the light and keeps out the wind and the rain, with all the knowledge and art requisite for preparing the beautiful and happy invention, without which these northern parts of the world could scarce have afforded a very comfortable habitation, together with the tools of all the different workmen employed in producing those different conveniencies. If we examine, I say, all these things and consider what a variety of labor is employed about each of them, we shall be sensible that without the assistance and cooperation of many thousands, the very meanest person in a civilized country could not be provided, even according to what we very falsely imagine, the easy and simple manner in which he is commonly accommodated. Very true today. Very much applicable to the modern economy if you just imagine, contemplate, meditate upon. Compared indeed with the more extravagant luxury of the great, his accommodation must no doubt appear extremely simple and easy, and yet it may be true, perhaps, that the accommodation of an European prince does not always so much exceed that of an industrious and frugal peasant, as the accommodation of the latter exceeds that of many an African king. The absolute the absolute master of the lives and liberties of 10,000 naked savages. Keep in mind that this was written in 1776, and perhaps this last phrase, and not perhaps, but it's very ignorant in many ways, because there were certainly tribes in Africa that had a rich culture and a very rich culture and tradition, especially in oratory and culture, that he wasn't aware of, and of course it's Eurocentric perspective. Anyways, Draganism aside, it was 1776, different era, although economically what is written, a great analysis, there has been a lot and still is applicable in many ways. The modern economy still functions, at least capitalist economy still functions in many ways the same way. Chapter 2 of the principle which gives occasion to the division of labor. The division of labor from which so many advantages are derived is not originally the effect of any human wisdom, which foresees and intends that general opulence to which it gives occasion. It is the necessary, though very slow and gradual consequence of a certain propensity in human nature, which has in view no such extensive utility, the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. Whether this propensity by one of those original principles in human nature, of which no further account can be given, or whether, as seems more probable, it be the necessary consequence of the faculties of reason and speech, it belongs not to our present subject to inquire. It is common to all men, and to be found in no other race of animals which seem to know neither this nor any other species of contracts. Two greyhounds, in running down the same hare, have sometimes the appearance of acting in some sort of concert. Each turns her towards his companion, or endeavors to intercept her when his companion turns her toward himself. This, however, is not the effect of any contract, but of the accidental concurrence of their passions in the same object at that particular time. Fascinating. Nobody ever saw a dog make a fair and deliberate exchange of one bone for another with another dog. Nobody ever saw one animal by its gestures and natural cries signify to another that this is mine, that is yours, I am willing to give this for that. When an animal wants to obtain something either of a man or of another animal, it has no other means of persuasion but to gain the favor of those whose service it requires. A puppy fawns upon its dam, and a spaniel endeavors by 1,000 attractions to engage the attention of its master who is at dinner, when it wants to be fed by him. Man sometimes uses the same arts with his brethren, and when he has no other means of engaging them to act according to his inclinations, endeavors by every servile and fawning attention to obtain their goodwill. He has not time, however, to do this upon every occasion. In civilized society he stands at all times in need of the cooperation and assistance of great multitudes, while his whole life is scarce sufficient to gain the friendship of a few persons. In almost every other race of animals, each individual, when it is grown up to maturity, is entirely independent, and in its natural state has occasion for the assistance of no other living creature. But man has almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren, and it is in vain for him to expect it from their benevolence only. He will be more likely to prevail if he can interest their self-love in his favor, and show them that it is for their own advantage to do for him what he requires of them. Whoever offers to another a bargain of any kind proposes to do this, Give me that which I want, and you shall have this which you want, is the meaning of every such offer. And it is in this manner that we obtain from one another the far greater part of those good offices which we stand in need of. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves, not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them off our own necessities, but of their advantages. Nobody but a beggar chooses to depend chiefly upon the benevolence of his fellow citizens. Even a beggar does not depend upon it entirely. The charity of well-disposed people indeed supplies him with the whole fund of his subsistence, but though this principle ultimately provides him with all the necessaries of life which he has occasion for, it neither does nor can provide him with them as he has occasion for them. The greater part of his occasional wants are supplied in the same manner as those of other people, by treaty, by barter, and by purchase. With the money which one man gives him, he purchases food. The old clothes which another bestows upon him he exchanges for other cold clothes which suit him better, or for lodging, or for food, or for money with which he can buy either food, clothes, or lodging as he has occasion. As it is by treaty, by barter, and by purchase that we obtain from one another the greater part of those mutual good offices which we stand in need of. So it is this same trucking disposition which originally gives occasion to the division of labor. In a tribe of hunters or shepherds, a particular person makes bows and arrows, for example, with more readiness and dexterity than any other. He frequently exchanges them for cattle or for venison with his companions, and he finds at last that he can in this manner get more cattle and venison than if he himself went to the field to catch them. From a regard to his own interest, therefore, the making of bows, that is, not bowels, but bows, bows, and arrows grows to be his chief business, and he becomes a sort of armorer. Another excels in making the frames and covers of their little huts or movable houses. He is accustomed to be of use in this way to his neighbors, who reward him in the same manner with cattle and with venison, till at last he finds it his interest to dedicate himself entirely to his employment and to become a sort of house carpenter. In the same manner, a third becomes a smith or a brazier, a fourth a tanner or dresser of hides or skins, the principal part of the clothing of savages. And thus the certainty of being able to exchange all that surplus part of the produce of his own labor, which is over and above his own consumption, for such parts of the produce as other men's labor as he may have occasion for, encourages every man to apply himself to a particular occupation, and to cultivate and bring to perfection whatever talent or genius he may possess for that particular species of business. The difference of natural talents in different men is, in reality, much less than we are aware of, and the very different genius which appears to distinguish men of different professions, when grown up to maturity, is not upon many occasions so much the cause as the effect of the division of labor. The difference between the most dissimilar characters, between a philosopher and a common street porter, for example, seems to arise not so much from nature as from habit, custom, and education. When they came into the world, and for the first 6 or 8 years of their existence, they were perhaps very much alike, and neither their parents nor playfellows could perceive any remarkable difference. About that age, or soon after, they come to be employed in very different occupations. The difference of talents comes to be taken notice of and widens by degrees, till at last the vanity of the philosopher is willing to acknowledge scarce any resemblance. But without the disposition to truck, barter, and exchange, every man must have procured to himself every necessary and conveniency of life which he wanted. All must have had the same duties to perform and the same work to do, and there could have been no such difference of employment as could alone give occasion to any great difference of talents, as it is this disposition which forms the difference of talents so remarkable among men of different professions, so it is this same disposition which renders that difference useful. Many tribes of animals acknowledged to be all of the same species derive from nature a much more remarkable distinction of genius than what antecedent to custom and education appears to take place among men. By nature a philosopher is not in genius and disposition half so different from a street porter as a mastiff is from a greyhound, or a greyhound from a spaniel, or this last from a shepherd's dog. Those different tribes of animals, however, though all of the same species, are of scarce any use to one another. The strength of the mastiff is not in the least supported either by the swiftness of the greyhound, or by the sagacity of the spaniel, or by the docility of the shepherd's dog. The effects of those different geniuses and talents, for want of the power or disposition to barter and exchange, cannot be brought into a common stock, and do not in the least contribute to the better accommodation and conveniency of the species. Fascinating. Remember reading this 13 years ago. Man. Accommodation and conveniency of the species. Each animal is still obliged to support and defend itself, separately and independently, and derives no sort of advantage from the variety of talents with which nature has distinguished its fellows. Among men, on the contrary, the most dissimilar geniuses are of use to one another, the different produces of their respective talents by the general disposition to truck, barter, and exchange being brought, as it were, into a common stock, where every man may purchase whatever part of the produce of other men's talents he has occasion for. He has occasion for. He has occasion for. Chapter 3. Part of the coffee scene. Chapter 3. Chapter 3. That the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. Chapter 3. That the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market, as it is the power of exchanging that gives occasion to the division of labor. So the extent of this division must always be limited by the extent of that power, or in other words, by the extent of the market. When the market is very small, no person can have any encouragement to dedicate himself entirely to one employment for want of the power to exchange all that surplus part of the produce of his own labor, which is over and above his own consumption, for such parts of the produce of other men's labor as he has occasion for. There are some sorts of industry, even of the lowest kind, which can be carried on nowhere but in a great town. A porter, for example, can find employment and subsistence in no other place. A village is by much too narrow a sphere for him. Even an ordinary market town is scarce large enough to afford him constant occupation. In the lone houses and very small villages which are scattered about in so desert a country as the Highlands of Scotland, every farmer must be butcher, baker, and brewer for his own family. In such situations we can scarce expect to find even a smith, a carpenter, or a mason within less than 20 miles of another of the same trade. The scattered families that live at 8 or 10 miles distance from the nearest of them must learn to perform themselves a great number of little pieces of work, for which, in more populous countries, they would call in the assistance of those workmen. Country workmen are almost everywhere obliged to apply themselves to all the different branches of industry that have so much affinity to one another as to be employed about the same sort of materials, A country carpenter deals in every sort of work that is made of wood, a country smith in every sort of work that is made of iron. The former is not only a carpenter, but a joiner, a cabinet maker, and even a carver in wood, as well as a wheelwright, a plowwright, a cart and wagon maker. The employments of the latter are still more various. It is impossible there should be such a trade as even that of a nailer in the remote and inland parts of the Highlands of Scotland. Such a workman at the rate of 1,000 nails a day and 300 working days in the year will make 300,000 nails in the year. But in such a situation, it would be impossible to dispose of 1,000, that is, of one day's work in the year. So he's hinting at production and consumption, or demand actually, supply and demand, not production and consumption also, but here it's more, to be in more economic terms, would be supply and demand, right? Because if he produces 300,000 nails in the year, but in a situation he can dispose of only 1,000, right? So supply and demand. So he's hinting at surplus production. It can be a surplus of production, as it is in many cases. As by means of water carriage, a more extensive market is opened to every sort of industry than what land carriage alone can afford it. So it is upon the sea coast and along the banks of navigable rivers. That industry of every kind naturally begins to subdivide and improve itself, and it is frequently not till a long time after that those improvements extend themselves to the inland parts of the country. A broad-wheeled wagon, attended by 2 men and drawn by 8 horses, in about 6 weeks' time, carries and brings back between London and Edinburgh near 4 ton weight of goods. In about the same time, a ship navigated by 6 or 8 men and sailing between the ports of London and Leeds frequently carries and brings back 2,000 ton weight, 200 ton weight of goods. 6 or 8 men, therefore, by the help of water carriage, can carry and bring back in the same time the same quantity of goods between London and Edinburgh as 50 broad-wheeled wagons attended by 100 men. So here, productivity, right, and transportation that facilitates the increase in productivity and the amount that we can transport by the means of different means. And now, of course, trains were not in Adam Smith's time in 1776. Maybe in somebody's mind they were imagining it, but they were, of course, not yet widespread. Might be mistaken, but I think the first train was in 1804, so 37 years after Adam Smith's publication of the book called Wealth of Nations, which is very relevant today. Not all of it, but certainly a lot, some, if not most parts. Wheel wagons attended by 100 men and drawn by 400 horses. Upon 200 tons of goods, therefore, carried by the cheapest land carriage from London to Edinburgh, there must be charged the maintenance of 100 men for 3 weeks, and both the maintenance and what is nearly equal to the maintenance, the wear and tear of 400 horses as well as of 50 great wagons. Whereas upon the same quantity of goods carried by water, there is to be charged only the maintenance of 6 or 8 men, and the wear and tear of a ship of 200 tons burden. But it's spelled Burthen, and now it's with a D, so it might have been spelled like that back then, or it means something else. Burthen, like a weight, burden, or burden. I would say with a D, burden, right? But maybe the spelling changed. Together with the value of the superior risk or the difference of the insurance between land and water carriage, where there no other communication between those two places, therefore, but by land carriage, as no goods could be transported from the one to the other except such whose price was very considerable in proportion to their weight. They could carry on but a small part of that commerce which at present subsists between them, and consequently could give but a small part of that encouragement which they at present mutually afford to each other's industry. There could be little or no commerce of any kind between the distant parts of the world. What goods could bear the expense of land carriage between London and Calcutta, India, or if there were any so precious as to be able to support this expense, with what safety could they be transported through the territories of so many barbarous nations? Keep in mind this is 1776. Those two cities, however, at present carry on a very considerable commerce with each other, and by mutually affording a market, give a good deal of encouragement to each other's industry. Since such, therefore, are the advantages of water carriage, it is natural that the first improvement of art and industry should be made where this conveniency opens the whole world for a market to the produce of every sort of labor, and that they should always be much later in extending themselves into the inland parts of the country. The inland parts of the country can for a long time have no other market for the greater part of their goods but the country which lies around about them and separates them from sea coast and the great navigable rivers. And with that, we wrap it up. Part 1 of Nations Coffee with Dragon. Coffee's over, so we'll wrap it up. World peace.